Well, hi, and welcome back to What Was Jesus Really Up To? I'm Scott Daniels. This is part 2, where we focus on what it means to be Easter people, really being open to that resurgence of life that comes through Jesus' way and truth of living. So, as we saw in the last screen from last talk, he was really juxtaposing what he was doing to what was going on at the temple, and all the conditionality that was there. It was really the mentality behind what was there. And he was trying to replace that mentality. In other words, go to God first, before any conditions. It's not like you have to do something like pay a debt or something like that before you can go to God, like to your parent, like a 2-year-old going back to mom or dad. The love is just there, and in fact the help to work through the very issues, maybe even the mindset that caused the problem, rather than trying to make a deal or have somebody else making a deal for us, which in some ways was a perspective that got into Christianity, right? So he said, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. So his resurrection being a beginning point in many ways of a new way of seeing relating to God. And you know, some people say they didn't rise from the dead, and in a way it doesn't hinge on that. You know, I think the question I would put to those folks is, would you make up a lie and then go out and die for it? Because of all the traditions we have of the disciples, except for John, they died witnessing to his resurrection. And I think what happened is some way he revealed to them that he still existed. I don't really care if it was in the body or not. I don't think it really matters. But he made it really clear that he loved them and was going to continue to work with them, be available to them, and any disciples, anybody who tried to follow him, anybody who turns to him, basically, you don't have to be even Christian, but that he will help anyone who's trying to come into this love relationship with God and then work from there, right? So the preconditional, unconditional love of God first, and then to participate in it as we go out and work through the conditions of life, rather than a conditional approach where you got to do something first and then maybe God will let you in. Okay, that's exactly backwards. Okay, but that's part of what happened because the mentality in Judaism, and let's face it, in humanity, is so conditional, right? We kind of judge first and then maybe we'll get to loving. In other words, set up conditions first and then maybe we'll get to loving. Well, he's saying do just the opposite. Go to God, get to loving first, and then deal with conditions. And in fact, that's what he did. He came and met us in the conditionality of the way humans do things usually, bringing unconditional love, saying let's make the connection first and be in the love of God together and then move from there. What happened though in Christianity in many ways is we see all sorts of different watered down versions, you might say, or shortcuts being taken that kind of shrunk actually Jesus in some ways. Here's a picture that I don't know if you can make it out very well there, but it says, you know, the longer you look at the man riding that woman, the funnier it gets. And sure enough, if you see it here, it looks like these are his legs here, and that he's riding her like a horse. And you kind of, it's true. The more you look at it, that's the way you end up seeing him, like his shoes down there. And the reality, of course, being he's about 10 feet behind and is a normal guy, but you don't really even see him that way after a while. And so we lose eyes to see, ears to hear. You know, it's the idea here, the analogy would be, after certain ways of seeing get so ingrained, it's easy to just see Jesus in a certain way like an icon and not really see what he was trying to give us, this golden thread of a way of life, a way of living that helps us move into communion with God, into, right, that relationship of connection, feeling the love of God and the guidance of heaven, and then moving from there. This is why Jesus said things like, seek ye first the kingdom of God and God's righteousness. That means be open to heaven, heavenly beings, because God sends messengers, sends angels. I think each one of us has a guardian angel. You know, Jesus said, allow the little children to come to me, that their angels are always before God. Well, that means everybody has an angel at childhood. I don't think that gets dropped when we get older, right? And so God is working through all these heavenly beings, really. I think also saints and ancestors. I've certainly experienced some of that, and I've talked to people who have experienced that. this wonderful thing. There's this team from the heavenly realms that is trying to help each and every one of us as we are open. That's why Jesus said, he talked about the kingdom of heaven more than God. That's interesting. In other words, those realms that are governed by the love of God, the light, right, this unconditional love, those who are participating in that, the angels certainly, ancestors, saints, they're going to try to help you. So be open to those relationships. You know, Jesus, time and time again, he's about the connection with God and with others, especially in the love of God. And then meet the conditions of your life. That's really what he did. Brought this unconditional love in to meet the conditions of life, rather than setting up conditional approaches, right, that might never get us to unconditional love, right? So, looking again at what happened in Christianity, the longer people looked at Jesus often, the wider interpretations became of him, and then arguments got going about, you know, even perspectives on Jesus. You get all this fragmentation in the church, end up with all these denominations, all this different stuff, and the process was people were trying to fit him and what he did into their way of seeing things, which is just human, right? Self-justification, right? Rather than making the changes that come from following his lead. And that's the key. That's actually where the gold is. That's how you get to the pearl of great price, is being done with the whole conditional mentality, that judging spirit, that any kind of putting people or ourselves on trial first, but rather be open to God's love first, and then move into life. Well, the watered down versions often took forms that I'm just going to play with a little bit here, because it's important to keep it light in terms of, let's not get too serious about it. I think Jesus has a great sense of humor, and in fact, there's a reason that we talk about, you know, be lighthearted. Well, that's connected with, you know, the light. In other words, we want to engage it for real, sincerely, but don't let heaviness take over, because that's not how God is. Watered down versions and shortcuts like, here's one I actually heard at a funeral: just accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior and you're done. He actually said that, literally. There was no conversation about being open to God or trying to be about love. He went right to just talking about all sorts of other things, and I was like, wow, that's missing, because believing in Jesus actually means trying to walk with him in God's love. You know, that word belief, think about when you look at someone you really know well and you say, I believe in you. Someone you love and respect. What are you saying? You're saying, I'm with you. I want to live in agreement with you, connected with you. That's the notion of belief in Jesus. It's, and remember he said, come to me all you who are weary and heavy burdened, I will give you rest. Take up my yoke. In other words, come into this kind of connection with me. And I love the Message version where he says, learn from me how to live the unforced rhythms of grace. This is how God works, right? That it's not forced, and yet very powerful. The unforced rhythms of grace, even giving us life. And we get signs of this, like in our breath. That's why breathing meditation is so good to settle in with. For our heartbeat, right? There's unforced rhythms, even though there's passion, like to a heartbeat, that give us life. To move into settling in with those things. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, but moving into communion with that spirit of life, giving us life, coming from God. And we'll talk about all that. But often the watered down versions and shortcuts don't get us to those things, right? So, and you end up with all sorts of things, like I just have a picture of the mansion that the Atlanta bishop just apologized for having, you know, $2.2 million that he constructed. And good for him, you know, seeing, hey, we got off track there, absolutely, you know. But it's, when you look at what happened is, you know, some Christians move towards more Old Testament or fundamentalist perspectives, very conditional in the approach. Some pretty much gave up on Christianity altogether, and some of these I would include went to church because you think, well, I'm supposed to do this, but then that didn't really have much impact on the rest of their life, right? And there's a lot of people, there's this old saying that some people are inoculated against Christianity. They got just enough, like in a vaccine, to not catch the real thing. And that's unfortunate, because then they don't get the pearl of great price, the feeling of God's love in their heart, you know, and that communion that comes when we really do that. And it's only by walking the way in the truth ourselves, personally, that starts to happen. And so that's the whole thing, is how to catch the real thing. You know, Jesus, he's inspired so many different people, and one gentleman who really got it was G.K. Chesterton, who he said, it's not that Christianity has been tried and failed. It's that Christianity hasn't really been tried. Now, I wouldn't go that far, certainly. But you see his point, right? You know, Nietzsche put it a lot more harsh. He said, the last Christian died on the cross. Well, I don't believe that. You know, we're all trying. But to get to that core message, rather than the shortcuts and watered down versions, that if we just work there, it doesn't get to our heart, that laser beam of love that Jesus brought, that we get, you know what I mean? I think the reason, like Christmas and Easter, are still so moving for us is that laser beam comes right through, right? But then to follow the path that it illuminates, that's the key. That's the key. And that's what we're trying to do here. Otherwise, we end up with approaches that often don't work to dealing with those elemental issues. Remember we talked about sex, money, and in-laws being problems for everybody. Thank you to Scott Peck for that image. But also survival and the fears that come up around those areas, those elemental issues of life, fundamental issues of life. Well, we often try all these other approaches that don't work. I don't know if you can read this one, but this one says, money is the root of all evil. Cleanse yourself here. It's a tip jar. It's pretty clever, you know, but what happened in our society is toned down, greed became respectable, but money still often costs too much when you think about it. If our ways of getting money, right, are so conditional that they keep us from getting to unconditional love or being able to participate in unconditional love, well, look what we did. We just kind of cut ourselves off in the very way we're seeing things, the way we're doing things. And that's, we want to get to unconditional love. That's what this is all about. And then this other one, I love Saturday morning cartoons when I was a kid. I still like to watch cartoons. But look at her, right? She's worshiping it. She's going to her mom and dad. You know, this is my God, I want to see the TV, you know, please let me go. Oh, you know, we don't want to ever worship the TV, right? Think about the notion of worship. It's to see the worth of something and to really value it. And so that's when we talk about worshiping God. It's not because God says, you got to worship me. No. See the value of God's unconditional divine love, creative love, the love through which we were created, because God is love. We are chips off the old block. This is the most precious thing in our hearts, is that desire to love and be loved unconditionally. With this, you know what I mean, just this wonderful love that we see in 2-year-olds or younger maybe. I love that iFunny I saw not too long ago where these two under 2-year-olds came together in an airport. They had never met each other before, never seen each other. They hugged each other, they kissed each other, they just played then beautifully. That's it, you know. Or think about when you're with your puppy, the unconditional love that comes. They just want to love you and then go from there and be loved, right? We have that desire in our hearts. But because of all the pains and pressures of life, we think we can't have it, that we have to start with conditionality first. But then the problem often is that we don't get to unconditional love. So we're going to get to more. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. The thing to see here is if we're worshiping other things and hoping that they're going to fulfill this promise of making us happy deeply, it's not going to happen because they don't go deep enough. You know, here there's a great ad for, you know, tacos breakfast coming March 27th, but the reality is it's diarrhea before noon, it says here. You know, that lots of times our solutions and clever ideas end up causing more problems than they solve. Here's one, I just love this. I'm going to let it just play for a little bit and you can see what's going on there. Great stage they made for this singing group, but look what happened. It wasn't grounded. It wasn't secure in a solid enough foundation. So often this is what happens to us. Our approaches don't address the foundational issues of life from a position secure enough in divine unconditional love, and rugs shift out from underneath us. Time and time again. All of us, me too. Right? And often we end up just trying harder and harder, but that just takes that stuff to the next level. I don't know if you can see that. It's a porta potty being lifted to the next level, and we'll just leave it at that. Our problem is not lack of effort, but ways of doing things that don't address those fundamental human issues, those heart issues. Things raised by Genesis and the Adam and Eve story. Problems raised by survival, sex, money, and in-laws, right? Power stuff, really. And traditional Christianity often isn't even really pushing us to get into that stuff. Well, here's another statement from Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas that's really made me think, and it fits totally with some other stuff in our Bible. Saying 18. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us, how will our end come?" Jesus said, "Have you found the beginning then, that you are looking for the end? You see, the end will be where the beginning is. Congratulations to the one who stands at the beginning. That one will know the end and will not taste death." The beginning, Genesis, is about the loss of faith in God, to love and work with us creatively through the challenges of life, around those fundamental issues, like survival, sex, money, in-laws, all that. Remember what happened in the story. I think this is where Jesus was pointing, and there's a couple other places where he hints at this. Remember, so Adam and Eve are created, male and female, right? And when you think about it, Genesis is so much richer than we tend to give it credit for. Here, sort of the Father God image creates with the Ruach, which is the Spirit of God, and it's a feminine energy, the Ruach. So it's masculine and feminine energies creating the world, and then creating humanity in the image of God, male and female, it says, they created them, and it's plural, actually, which is very interesting. Okay? I'm not saying there's not a oneness to God, there is a oneness, but it's the oneness of, say, water, where you have, water can be, and this is why the Trinity is a good image of it, is like a solid would be more the Son, or you might call Emmanuel, God with us, or daughter, you could say, definitely. The Father would be more like the ocean, or the Mother would be more like the ocean, right? And then the Spirit would be more like the vapor. So there's a oneness to water, but different forms. And to be open to, actually, in the Bible, in our traditions, there's both masculine and feminine. But the patriarchy in institutional Christianity focused on the masculine. It's just that simple. Time and time again, too, we see this. The Sophia of God is feminine, the wisdom of God. Jesus says, wisdom, Sophia, she, and it's a personal name there, is justified by her children, calling himself one of her children. Very interesting, and we see this. There's 2 or 3 places that are very clear of the masculine and feminine. It's just the tradition only focused on certain things and emphasized the more patriarchal. Well, we're trying to get more of that harmony, that balance. And the Genesis story actually has clues to this very thing, if we can see them. Eyes to see, ears to hear them. Anyway, so male and female, they're created, Adam and Eve, the notion there. Of course, I see it as kind of a myth. It doesn't really matter if you take it literally or figuratively. The message is still the same. They are created, they're told, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil rooted in the world. Because as humans, you're not going to be able to sort all that out. You don't have a big enough perspective, right? But then the accuser, that's what Satan means, the accuser, right? The one who's going to judge and put on trial through suspicion, says, no, God doesn't really care that much about you when he's talking to Eve, He's trying to hold you down. You should go ahead and eat that so you can be like God, right? That whole thing. So she does, trying to gain power. But then, right, as she gives it to Adam, they conclude that they're naked. Well, when God then is walking in the garden like a breeze, so again, you got this actually both masculine and feminine thing going on, right? The Spirit being more feminine, right? All this stuff. Adam and Eve hide because they're naked and we're ashamed. Well, God's response is, why are you hiding from me? God doesn't get mad to start with at all. But why are you hiding from me? And they say, because we were naked and we were ashamed. And God says, well, who told you you were naked? Who said that was a problem? You were always naked. It wasn't a problem. You see, their notions of good and evil, right and wrong, what's good and what's not good, have gotten involved in such a way that now shame is leading them to be separate from God. And they're ashamed of their nakedness, their sexuality, quite frankly. And it's taking them away from God. And God says, well, gee, what are we going to do now? Because if you're going to hide from me on all these things, how do you reach someone who's actively trying to hide from you? That's the fundamental issue, isn't it? Especially if their notions of right and wrong, good and evil, are twisted such that, right, they think it's good to hide. it doesn't work. This is the issue that's being addressed in the Genesis story that so often is missed. And then they get into this blame and shame game. It just keeps getting worse, basically, doesn't it? The condemning spirit, the judging spirit that would condemn, shame, push down, right, takes over to control, right? And God says, well, if you're going to see things like that, then we got to get a different situation here. If you're going to try to live like independent contractors, rather than from your fundamental love relationship with God, it'd be better for you not to be in paradise, because that's not going to work here. That's not how the heavenly realms work. They work from unconditional love first, and then getting into the conditions of life. So there you go. And that's what Jesus is pointing out in the Gospel of Thomas. This is why the Passover story is so important, why I think he chose to come to Jerusalem at Passover. And he said, just as Moses lifted up the serpent there, right, in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. This is how I think he saw his work on the cross. So go back to the Passover story, right? The Jewish people had been in Egypt ever since the time of Joseph. Started out positively, but then Pharaoh gets scared, so he starts pushing them down, right? Very conditional towards them, all the way to the point where they become slaves. He makes them slaves. And then after a long time of this, actually, Moses is out in the wilderness probably praying as a shepherd. Lots of time open to God. He sees the burning bush, right? So a weird thing, but he's very open to the journey. He comes into a fundamental communion with God, a love relationship with God, and then God is going to use him to deliver the people of Israel from the Egyptians. So he goes, and then after this series of plagues, Pharaoh's given all sorts of chances, right? Well, then God says, have everyone who wants to, basically, slaughter an unblemished lamb, eat the Passover meal, put the blood of the lamb over their doorpost. Basically symbolic of, we are now going to be gods, so to speak, and then I will deliver you. And this is what happens. So first is this come into communion, right? Each person coming back to a grounding faith in God, God's love, desire to deliver us, to free us from the ways of Egypt, the conditionality, the judging, the trial first sort of thing. And then all the forces and threats that get involved in that way of being governed, to the promised land. And sure enough, everybody who does that, right, is delivered as they are ready, then preparing for the journey, that they leave, they are freed, but then they go out into the desert, right, making this journey to the promised land, because now the issue is how to get the ways of Egypt out of the people. And that's a struggle, because pretty soon they're complaining. It doesn't take long at all. They get manna, they have enough food and all this, but the manna tastes terrible, and that's their whole diet, so I recognize that. They're complaining. They actually want to go back to Egypt, saying it's better to be under Pharaoh but have a variety of foods and plenty of food, rather than, and a sense of security, right? This whole thing, rather than being out here on this journey with God. Wow. And this is when snakes come, very symbolic, and they're biting people and people are dying. Well, it's this, the notion is, right, the snake is moving in them, the serpent in the wilderness, right? Suspicion of God, not thinking God has their interests in mind, not trusting the process of getting the ways of Egypt out of us, right? Yeah, it's very powerful, very potent imagery. And so Moses goes to God and says, hey, people are dying, what should I do? And God says, kill a snake, put it on your staff, and then when people look at it in faith, they will be healed. And that's exactly what happens. The killing of those snakes. And then believing in God to deal with that as we have faith for God to deliver us all the way home to the promised land. Very interesting for Jesus to use that very image, right? Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, I will be lifted up on the cross, so that whoever believes in me joins me in this faith in God that heals us and then delivers us, will not perish but have everlasting life. Wow. So Jesus did pay the ultimate price to make a way of deliverance clear. But it wasn't like there was a need to pay off God or pay debts or all this before God would let us come home. Right? He gave his life as an investment, a beginning point for a new way of living, an antidote for snake-bit humanity. Jesus saw that the old sacrificial system actually kept people in the conditional blame and shame game. Think about that. The old system did. And this made its way into Christianity in many ways. It's because it's human, right? It just is not a means of unconditional love, but conditional love. In other words, once you meet the conditions, well then maybe we'll love, right? So a lot of good's been done. But with that at the door, it doesn't get us to unconditional love, right? And as Einstein said, you cannot solve a problem from the same mindset that created it. Right? Jesus brought a different mindset. Some forms of Christianity continue that conditional mindset, so the relief of unconditional love doesn't really get through. The peace that passes understanding doesn't come through because we're still judging ourselves, even in our relationship with God. And that's what he's wanting us to let go of, he, she. Right? So Jesus' ministry and death on the cross revealed an entirely different approach and goal, communion. That secures us in God's heavenly, unconditional love first. Now I'm just going to show you a video. As you watch it through a couple times, you'll get it. He introduced a whole different kind of power. It's that power we experience being at home in God's unconditional love. That's the love that actually makes us feel at home. Think about what makes you feel at home. Isn't it when you come to rest with someone? Where you can trust them and they trust you. And then there's this flow of good intentions, first and foremost, and a desire to just be in connection, in agreement, in tune with each other, we say. And then we'll create from there. We'll move from there. That approach, and this is why I talk about the rest that works, opens us to this grounding in God's love that is actually more powerful than any of the threats and violence in our world. It's the kind of love Jesus brought as he shot that laser beam from that cross, revealing a different way, a way of light through the darkness. Unconditional divine love is the most powerful thing in our lives because it's what we were created from. It's actually, we talk about that God-shaped hole in everybody's heart that isn't filled until the love of God is there. This is part of why, Jude says, keep yourselves in the love of God. Paul says, let the love of God rule your hearts. That's why Jesus said, start with God. Right? The Spirit behind and within all of life, who is love, creative love, our Creator's love. And then go from there. We often think we can't have it because of the pains and pressures of life. Very human, right? But Jesus says, start there, open to heavenly love, trust that heaven will guide you, has your best interest in mind, knows where you're at, right? Can handle all of that. God can handle us as well as our situation. And as we stay open and work from that deep desire to love unconditionally, like a child, this is that, unless you become like children, right, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. We have to be open again, right? Beginner's mind, I love in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki says, keep a beginner's mind. Because in the mind of the expert, the possibilities are few. But in the beginner's mind, the possibilities are endless. That's so true. I mean, God can do anything. God can handle anything. We have to get back to that perspective and openness to God. It doesn't mean be childish, but be open and trusting like a child with God. Have faith and work with God in love step by step is Jesus' message. His sacrifice was an investment for deliverance leading to communion. Deliverance from the ways of Egypt into the unconditional love of God to make the journey to full communion with God and others in love, where we're really at home again. This is why for me the central image of Christianity really should be communion. The cross is a part of what leads to that, right? So you see there on a rock, there's a little cross on a rock. But the goal is communion. That was what Jesus made so clear. He says to the disciples on the night of Passover, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. That's the only time we're told he has eagerly desired anything. And then he goes through the whole, sacrifice, going back to the Lamb of God. John the Baptist called him the Lamb of God, the Paschal Lamb. Paul makes it very clear, saying he was the Paschal Lamb. Jesus seems to have very clearly seen himself as the Paschal Lamb, saying, this is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you. Well, the Paschal Lamb is all about deliverance, faith in God. Remember putting that blood of the Lamb over the doorpost, eating the lamb, symbolizing I'm moving back into a faith relationship with God, fundamentally. Our professor, when I was there in Israel, he said, you would never eat a lamb or anything else on which sin had been placed, because that would symbolize taking the sin into you. So on the Day of Atonement, they actually would put sins on the scapegoat, put it out in the wilderness, and then sins on animals, and then burn them. Nobody ate those sacrifices. You wouldn't eat those because the symbolism would be all messed up. That would be taking sin back in. The whole point of Jesus, in the way he saw the sacrifice he did make, is deliverance. Deliverance into a whole new way of living out of faith in God. Being able to move into the love of God so we can live in love and then go from there, meeting the conditions of life. So here we look back at this perspective. What it really means is to get that God is already with us in the parking lot. That God is just seeking communion wherever we are, on the trail, wherever that might be. So if we're here in Wisconsin, maybe to throw snowballs, with Jesus and with God. That we are like expressions of God, like breaths of God. That's what the Genesis story says. It's the breath of God coming into material human bodies is how we were created. That we're each like a breath of God, the way Jesus talked about it, right? The vine and the branches. I think if he had to say over, maybe he did say it this way, he would say, I'm in the vine, you guys are in the branches. In other words, he's in that state where he was in this oneness with God through the love of God, and able to bring that through miraculously. The line between human and divine getting lost in him, and then saying, you guys are stuck out there in the branches where you think you're all on your own, when the reality is you are connected. Think about branches, they're always connected. But if they see themselves as independent contractors, right, they can be just really shaken up by the storms and all that stuff, rather than realizing it's all about settling in with God wherever we are, right? Being open to heaven, the kingdom of heaven, all the ways they're trying to help us, heavenly beings, angels, etc. Wherever we are, settling in, being true to who God created each one of us to be. You'll see on the map, I'm just putting us wherever we are on the map of life. And then be in that communion as we make that journey through our lives. This is why, again, Passover for Jesus meant so much. It's coming into that communion with God first, but then with each other, right? That's the whole goal, in this love of God, that then changes things. And if you get right back to it, in John basically 13 through 17, the disciples are very stressed out and worked up, because he said he's going to have to die, and they don't get that, and all this, so they're very confused. Well, we tend to be like them, right? And he says to them, do not let your hearts be troubled, do not let them be afraid, believe in God, believe also in me. In other words, don't let those fears govern you and lead you to the ways of the world to try to deal with it, right? All the trouble, right? Rather, believe in God, believe in me, right? And walk my way in truth. That's what I think he was trying to say with that statement. It wasn't an ego statement. It was that there's a way to do this, that if you will walk it, right, you will have life. And then he talks about abide in God as I abide in God, make your home in me, God and I will make our home in you. Right? This whole thing is come into communion. Come into this state where you are open to God and make your home in God's love so that you can be at home. You have a home. Why not be at home, right, with God? And then you will be able to branch out like a branch. Think about it. Best thing for a branch to do is make sure first and settle into the vine, right? To the source of life for it. That's this notion of the rest, right? That as we settle in, coming to rest like a branch in a vine, really open that channel with God through our hearts, through that center that is each of our hearts, and then be open to the flow of love coming from our Creator in that way, that then leads us to be able to blossom and flourish. That's the key for a branch in a vine, right? And that's what Jesus was trying to say. Follow this pattern, this way and this truth. Come to me, all of you who labor, I will give you rest. That works. That's the notion. That's the whole idea. Through this communion, first and foremost, that deals with all the conditionality in life, all the judging spirit, it actually kills the snake that would just judge first, right? And actually opens us to the creative elemental energies that you might call the kundalini energies in proper harmony. This is the notion in yoga that once the body, mind, and spirit are in harmony, those kundalini energies, the creative, mysterious forces of creation that are of God and very positive, very healthy, actually bring us life and resurrection. This is the thing, is Jesus, he was very organic, and Christianity just kind of missed this, right? I mean, he calmed a storm, he turned water into wine, he makes bread and fish just materialize. I mean, wow. I mean, he was really in tune with the spirit behind and within life, the real creative spirit in the material world. And yet we miss this in so many ways, just how organic he was. And that's where someone like St. Francis, he got back in touch with that brother, sun, sister, moon, and that whole perspective he brought. Be open to the spirit behind and within life, and in you, singing your heart song. Maddie Stepanek talks about your heart song, and to be really true to that heart song, because that's where the Creator is going to express through you. You are actually a branch, an expression of God. It's this beautiful thing when we get it, right? We're not God in God's totality. We should never say we're God, but we are part of God, like a cell, like a branch. The communion reveals that. I am the vine, you are the branches, all that sort of thing. I'm in the vine, branches. There's actually this oneness as we get it. It's not about ego at all. And Passover is where that starts in the Jewish tradition. Communion, which is not about a little tiny bread or a little tiny bit of juice. If that opens you to God and communion, wonderful. It can be a wonderful ritual, means of opening us to, but it's certainly not just about that, right? No, it's about the spirit of taking this life into us, this life of God that was in Jesus, this weight and this truth, and then living it ourselves. So that laser beam is actually hitting the target of our hearts. And then as we're interacting with others, the light can be shared heart to heart. So what was Jesus really up to? That's it. Engaging the fears raised by the fundamental issues of life, survival, sex, money, family system stuff, and let's face it, all that stuff is there, right? Offering divine unconditional love is the antidote for being snake bit, the mindset that moves first with a suspicious, accusing spirit, like a little snake, that only offers love conditionally, if at all. Jesus turns that way of society upside down, inviting us to move with God's unconditional love first, and then be streetwise about it. He wasn't Pollyannish about this. He said, be innocent as doves, and then wise as serpents. But the order is kind of important. Have that innocent intent, the desire to love and be loved, respecting others, treating others the way we want to be treated, first and foremost, right? And then, be wise as a serpent. Be streetwise about it. Yeah, do be practical about it. You still have to make judgments. We still have to discern, is this healthy, is this bad, is this right or wrong? Is this in alignment with love? Any situation. But the goal, right, is to keep seeing that spark of the God Spirit in everybody as a child of God, first and foremost, and then engage the conditions of life after that, and create better conditions out of the love of God. This is why, forgive 70 times, 7 times, right? Why even love your enemies? Well, the only way you possibly could is if you are actually feeling and secure in the love of God, and then able to say, oh wow, my brother, my sister, of anybody, and then approach them in love, aimed at their heart, rather than whatever the conditions are that have been placed around them, or how they're approaching us, the judgments approaching us. So, his life and death affirmed that approach as the way to what we really want, resurrection, or the resurgence of our Creator's unconditional love in our hearts, that elemental creative love in the world, spirit behind and within all of life, and it reunites us then with those elemental creative forces in ways that are really healthy. Like now, those creative, mysterious forces like around sexuality and all that stuff that Christianity tends to have such a problem with, right? Well, now it can become very healthy. There's a reason the Kundalini energies are connected with sexuality. It can be very healthy now once it's in alignment, once it's in that bringing together the harmony that divine love brings. Leading to healing, wholeness, and eternal life for us and for others, being able to live in our Creator's love here and now as well as in the afterlife. This is why you have the caduceus. It's one of the most ancient images of healing. And there you see the Kundalini energies coming up, the snakes, male and female. Very interesting, right? Bringing this harmony and wholeness, body, mind, and spirit. That's why yoga is about the yoke. That's actually what yoga means, yoke. A body, mind, and spirit in harmony. So, world of antiquity got a lot of this stuff. We forgot some of it, so we want to get some of that mysterious and spiritual stuff going more. We need it now. We need it for harmony, because we're so out of harmony with the mysterious and spiritual in our world, as well as in our own hearts. In the modern world, we don't want to condemn the modern world. I'm filming this with an iPhone. It's awesome what science has given us. Science is awesome. Martin Luther King Jr. had a great perspective on this. He said, science and religion should be like the wings of a bird. They both need to be strong and honoring each other, and then we can fly. And that's really what we're going after now, reclaiming the mysterious and spiritual in conjunction with science and the awesome things that science has brought us, right? No need for attack, either way. And then the recognition that the ways of Egypt do still govern our world. In other words, govern how things are really done. I'm not saying it's all bad. People are loving each other all the time. But often the way things are governed is first we meet the conditions and then we can love from within them. Well, that's good, but the thing that really gives us peace is to actually have unconditional love first and foremost, and then engage the conditions of life. So we're not approaching each other preconditionally, with all these preconditions before we would even decide if we're going to work with someone or try to love them or anything like that. No, we try to love first because God loves us, and we can live in that love. We can stay in that love through our hearts. Remember Jesus saying the kingdom of heaven is within you. Find that, be open to that channel, tune in, right? And the tradition even has this, turn your radio on as an old gospel song, tune in to the love of God through your own heart so you can feel it, dance to it, and then you'll be able to dance with others. So this is why the vision of the center, it's basically start with love and respect, just because that's how God approaches us, period. And so start there, try to keep a lighthearted sense of it, and then move from there, encouraging everybody to go to your center where you find that creative spirit in your life that's unique to you in terms of how you're an expression of God. And that's why we have all sorts of different things like pottery and yoga and art and all that, in addition to meditation and prayer times and Anamkara soul care groups and spiritual direction. All these things to be true to how God created each one of us and what brings us into feeling that communion, that connection with the creative spirit in us, with God in us. And it's different for everybody. And so how to create space for that. And this is what I encourage every spiritual community to do, is that greater spirituality that is greater than any religion, but is actually a thread in all the major religions. Honor that, right? Really honor going to that center that is true to how God created you. And then encourage each other in doing that. And trust the Spirit to move from there, the holy healing Spirit to move from there. That's what brings healing, right? Personally and collectively. It's what Jesus was really intending all the way through. So here it is. I'm going to actually go all the way to the end here. Book of Revelation. How will the kingdom of heaven come on earth? Well, it'll be as people choose to come into communion with the kingdom of heaven through sharing God's love with each other as humans. We do this as we realize God and members of the heavenly realms love us and are trying to help us. We can settle in with them, make a home here with them in our hearts, and reject moving first with a judging, malicious, condemning spirit. The spirit represented by the serpent in the Garden of Eden. This is how Jesus is going to cast Satan out, so to speak. That's how God is going to remove Satan from this world. And I'm not saying there's a personal being Satan, but rather that movement of spirit, right? That can so often come up because of our fears and govern things, even in how we're living, the ways of Egypt, right? As people choose to follow people like Jesus, others like Buddha, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., that movement of spirit that we call Satan, the accuser, the judger, will no longer be accepted as a governing spirit in people's hearts, but rather find, right, that whole notion, and I'm not going to say it's Satan, but the process of judgment and discernment, finding its proper place, right, as an elemental spirit, right, that does come out of fear and does need to discern things. That's why Jesus said, innocent as a dove, but streetwise as a serpent. So in other words, that street wisdom will find its proper place allowing the positive creative energies like Kundalini energies to work their magic in harmony with the higher energies, creating heaven on earth. You know, higher or lower, that's not really the way to think about it, but rather you might say earthly energies, and then maybe more heavenly energies bringing heaven to earth. Earthly opportunities to heaven is the other way to see this. I think this is an amazing arena. I think materiality, especially when we're on the other side, we're going to realize, wow, it's like the leading edge of creation, and what an exciting place to be. But only as we do find that harmony that really frees our hearts from the ways of Egypt to love and be loved unconditionally and create from there. That's when life feels so great. That's what this is all about, and it's what Jesus intended. That's what he's still working on, heart by heart, because that's the way the kingdom comes. Heart by heart, and heart to heart, in between snowballs. So I just invite you to play with him on that, be open to him. I promise you that he's amazing in terms of the journey he will help you with, the connections he will help you make. Be open, because it might be you have a greater sense of awareness of your angel. Great, that's wonderful, it's not weird, it's great. Or the other connections in your life, maybe someone that you would never have suspected. It's going to help you create and connect with that love of God that's unconditional. Awesome. Awesome. Keep moving with that. And that'll be the process of communion that leads to helping us be at home here in the world and create that homemaking love that helps everybody to experience that. That's how the kingdom will come. My prayer for you is that that would happen more and more, and that this helps bring out that golden thread, that golden opportunity, that pearl of great price Jesus was offering us. Thank you very much. Have a great day.